you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening for what is coming to the end of our week of celebrating homecoming virtually for the first time ever. We're really thrilled that you could join us this evening for what I think is going to be a really exciting conversation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Anna Wyeth. I'm the Director of Alumni Programs here at Sidwell Friends, and I'm very excited to introduce you to our speakers in just a minute. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. If you feel comfortable, I would really encourage you to keep your video on. That really helps us feel the full participation of everyone that's in the room. And additionally, if you can, go ahead and change your Zoom name to include your full name and your class year if you're an alum, or if your constituency, if you are perhaps a parent of an alum or a current or former faculty member or a current family. Again, that just helps us all feel who's here, and for those folks who we might not know personally or recognize, to see who all is here and how you're connected to Sidwell Friends. And if you've never done that before, you can go hover over your own name in the participant list and select rename, and then you'll be able to change your Zoom name. As we go along tonight, if you have questions, please feel free to send them in the chat to me, Anna Wyeth, or my colleague, Sarah Duda, who is also here tonight helping with this event. Our panelists are not going to be looking at the chat as they're engaged in the conversation. So if you have questions, send them along to us and we'll make sure that they get asked, or we will give you the opportunity later in the night as we get into the Q&A portion to ask a question of the panelists yourself. So without further ado, let me introduce Bob Levey, who is going to introduce our other two panelists as well tonight. Bob is the parent of two Sidwell Friends alums and is a prize-winning journalist who has covered the Washington scene since the Johnson administration. For 23 years, he wrote a daily column, Bob Levey's Washington, for the Washington Post, and we are just thrilled to have him lead this evening's conversation. So Bob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Hi, everybody, and happy homecoming to all of you in the Sidwell Friends family. It really is a family, isn't it? And I say that as one who has not had a child in the school for more than 15 years, and I still feel the tug. And I think all of you do too. It's a nice, nice bunch, and thanks for being here tonight. Let me introduce my fellow panelists. Zeeshan Aleem is a contributing writer for Vox and VICE. He has been published in The Atlantic, The Nation, The Guardian, Esquire, GQ, Politico, HuffPost, The American Prospect, and other publications. Jonah Bromwich is a journalist at the New York Times. He covers cultural change, shifts in the way we think, eat, date, and use language and technology. He does that for the style section. We're going to hold forth about the First Amendment tonight. We're going to talk among the three of us for about 40 minutes, and then the floor will be open to your questions. And I know I speak for Jonah and Zeeshan when I say any question is fair game. Journalists are used to asking lots of impertinent questions, and I hope you will do the same, because we will answer them pertinently and impertinently, I'm sure. Gentlemen, let's begin with a look at the First Amendment. And before we get into our actual dialogue, let me first say that the First Amendment is my dearest friend. I love it. It is the essential freedom in the United States, I think, along with the freedom of religion. The First Amendment has given me a more than 50-year career in journalism. It has paid a shocking number of Sidwell Friends school tuitions. It is just a wonderful, wonderful capstone and cornerstone of freedom in our country. But now here we are in a world of journalism where the internet gets to be more dominant every single day, this rushing river of information without a lot of guidelines, without a lot of guardrails. I believe that the First Amendment has changed its definition and its usefulness in the world of internet journalism. But let's take each of you in turn and see if you agree with that, and if you do, why and how. Zeeshan, since you're the older of the two there, you're up.
I really think that we should really spotlight the youth, and maybe Jonah should start off with that question.
So, okay, youth should be served. Okay, Jonah, youth will be served.
Thanks, Zeeshan. I really appreciate that. Luckily, I was just reading about this, knowing that I was about to do this. I think there's one aspect of the internet and the First Amendment question that is really interesting, which is the First Amendment, of course, promotes freedom of speech, and along with that, freedom of the press. And we tend to think of that as something that is anti-censorship, right? So the press thrives when it is not contending with censorship, when it is not contending with people stopping it. One of the problems we have with the internet is not that there's too little speech, that there's not too many people tamping down on speech, but there's too much, that there's so much, and that the internet has kind of allowed anyone who wants to gush forth with whatever they want. And I do think it will lead to a rethinking, maybe not of the First Amendment itself, but of how it applies to journalism. And then, of course, how readers of journalism understand the information they're receiving. And I think, what the internet has done is made it more difficult for people who don't have that kind of comprehension to do that. So that's my take.
Okay, Zeeshan, the older of the two.
There's so many different ways to approach this question. And then what sort of one thing that comes to mind when thinking about the way the internet has reshaped the way we think about freedom of speech is, I think the internet's also influenced the way we think about freedom of sort of open debate and expression. And I think the internet has sort of created this paradox where on one hand, we have a greater spectrum of debate of ideas on an ideological level than we've ever seen prior to the sort of popularization of the internet. So, for example, it's no longer just the broadsheets like the New York Times and the Washington Post, both great newspapers that are defining sort of popular discourse, but also a lot more sort of niche journals. For example, on the left, you might see small socialist publications like Jacobin and Current Affairs, really changing the way that people in the popular conversation talk about, what's realistic on healthcare, what's desirable, and simultaneously, civil society has been expanded through social media to the point where our sense of mass opinion is sort of more diverse and idiosyncratic than it was before. On the other hand, the other sort of side of this is that we've also seen the speed and intensity with which people can be expelled from certain political or intellectual scenes is sort of unprecedented. And what I mean by that is that in certain sorts of situations, a certain kind of misstep or a transgression of a norm on what you're supposed to say within a certain, say, publication or a certain political scene can result being sort of fired or shunned at a pace unlike which we've seen before. And, I don't think that's quite the same thing as saying that the First Amendment doesn't exist. Those people are still able to express themselves in the public square in the sense that those people could go out onto a street corner and say what they want to, but they do have face more obstacles to expressing themselves in the court of public opinion where it's influential. And we can walk through examples of that. David Shore comes to mind. He was sort of fired from Civis Analytics and kicked off Progressive listserv for raising questions about the efficacy of riots from a perspective that was actually liberal, but ended up being sort of hounded online and sort of kicked out of sort of progressive scenes that I think actually makes certain political scenes less intellectually robust and in a way that's sort of counterproductive. So those are sort of two examples. Yeah.
Gentlemen, as you know, as we all know, the internet not only has led to cancel culture of the kind that Zeeshan just mentioned, but it is just a festering swamp of trolling, of political hate speech, of pornography. Is this something that needs to be controlled with the First Amendment in mind? Jonah, you seem to be saying that we do need new guardrails and new protections. Facebook is looking at this, Twitter is looking at this, other big social media outlets are looking at this. What should we be doing about this?
So there are several questions here at once, and it's one of the problems with talking about the internet as capital T, capital I, the internet, because what we're really talking about is a host of social media platforms with which we're all familiar, and then other servers that are hosting sites that are really kind of more putrid and horrible, like 8chan and 4chan, which are also social networks, but which we almost have to ask the servers to regulate them because the networks themselves are not going to do it. So in terms of what we as a polity should be asking of the social media companies, I think it's exactly what you just said, Bob. I think we need fiercer guardrails. We need them to be understand the role they play, which is as venues that in which the public square exists, and that there's real responsibility with that.
Yeah, but freedom means freedom, doesn't it, Jonah? Congress shall make no law. That's what the words say of the First Amendment. And Congress wanted robust speech. It wanted speech that could offend. It wanted speech that could shock. So do we really need guardrails when that's what was written more than 200 years ago?
Well, even after that was written, you know, John Adams was able to prosecute people under the Sedition Act kind of early on for kind of breaking laws as he saw. So the First Amendment hasn't always stopped political powers from pursuing free speech. Now, that's not what I'm suggesting be done, but I don't think that guardrails on speech, particularly on these platforms, are out of the question. And then furthermore, these are private companies, and so they're operating venues kind of in the private space. And I think talking about regulation of those venues is very different from talking about regulation of speech in the public square.
Zeeshan, same question for you, recognizing that you don't work for the good gray lady that's a pillar of the establishment. You don't work for the Washington Post, which is a pillar of the establishment. Is your view any different?
I think we would have to get pretty specific about what we mean by guardrails, but on a sort of a general note, I will say that I am very skeptical and suspicious of empowering sort of monopolistic tech companies to regulate public speech in any sort of serious way. And I say this knowing that there's a lot of tough questions right now and a lot of analytic dilemmas we have about, you know, places like Facebook have become accelerants for disinformation and misinformation and hate speech and incitement of violence in ways that are just jaw-dropping, you know, famously probably playing a serious role in accelerating, you know, ethnic cleansing in Southeast Asia, you know, sort of giving more weight than there should be to fake news operations from sort of meddling foreign powers and so on. Those things are worrying, but simultaneously, the more we give power to these platforms to sort of intervene, we raise a possible risk of them becoming ideological censors as well. And of course, we've already seen many examples of uneven enforcement of things. So I wish that I actually had done a little bit more sort of reading into what went on with the Hunter Biden New York Post article that, you know, for those who aren't familiar, in New York Post published an article that was supposed to have been a sort of allegations about correspondence from Hunter Biden, son of Joe Biden, that seems to have been based on sort of hacked materials. I can't go into sort of depth about sort of like the forensics of that. But what caused controversy this week was both Facebook and Twitter took efforts to make it harder to share online. Twitter specifically made it so you couldn't share the link. And originally it just says you can't share this link because it's harmful. They didn't really explain what was going on. After some inquiries, my understanding is they said that the reason they tried halting the spread of the information was because it was hacked based on hacked materials. But that is also concerning because a lot of journalism is based on information that may have been hacked. Obviously, things like WikiLeaks, information that the journalists use from places like WikiLeaks may have originated through hacks. There's all sorts of complicated questions about the ethics of what kind of hacked material you can use.
Yeah.
But the point is, as Twitter's becoming more aggressive about this kind of thing, there's opacity, and there is clearly sort of increasing level of audacity from these companies to say what should be censored. And as someone who likes to say unpopular things from time to time, it makes me concerned about me being on the wrong side of a certain kind of debate.
Yeah, ideally, I don't think the two approaches would be mutually exclusive. I think there could be public pressure on the platforms to curb speech, and also public pressure, that speech go elsewhere, that maybe the platforms be broken up. That being said, to Zeeshan's point just now, the governance of these platforms doesn't seem sophisticated enough or have the kind of baseline that it would take to govern speech and regulate speech in the ways we'd like to see. And so when they do make efforts, and he's absolutely right that they're doing more of that these days, they do seem really haphazard and it's unclear where they're coming from. And so I think it's a really important point that though we'd like to see them, or at least I'd like to see them do this in a responsible manner, there are many examples of them seemingly unable to do just that.
Well, Jonah, you just uttered the secret word, because this is what I wanted to pursue based on what we were just talking about. The First Amendment is about freedom, but it is really difficult not to weld to that freedom the issue of responsibility. We all know the cliche about the First Amendment not giving you the right to shout fire in a crowded theater. But if you look back at journalism history over the last 100 years or so, voluntarily, big newspapers, big television networks, television stations, radio networks have almost always done three things. One, they have not publicized troop movements during war because they have been persuaded that it was in the national interest not to do that. They have not publicized the names of rape victims. They pulled back from that out of fairness to the victim. Almost no organ in this country publicizes the name of a juvenile who is charged with a crime. The argument is that if the kid is only 14, you should give him a chance. So this may or may not be seen as an abridgment of freedom. It may be seen more as a synthesis between freedom and responsibility. And Jonah and Zeeshan, in that order, I'd like you each to comment about that.
Sorry, say that last part again, Bob.
The issue is not freedom. I see this as freedom being welded to responsibility. That there are situations where freedom, just saying and publishing anything you want, cannot work for a variety of reasons, the examples that I gave.
I'd agree with that. And I think one of the things that's happened for journalists who are connected to a single institution or who freelance at multiple institutions, it doesn't matter. They also have their own publishing platforms available to them. So at this very moment, I could go on Twitter and I could say, Bob Levy's really treating me poorly in this, and just start kind of throwing insults at you. I have the absolute power to do that. No one at my publications could stop me. And it actually would come with the weight of the New York Times, because that's what it says in my bio. So I think considerations like the ones that you just raised that have kind of been observed throughout have just multiplied. And there are so many, and the responsibilities that attend being a journalist now. Essentially, you can solve a lot of the problems just by keeping your mouth shut more often than not. But of course, you also have a prerogative to get your name out there and to promote yourself. And so I think it's a very, very difficult time. And it takes, perhaps not more judgment than ever before, but certainly you need to resist that temptation to say what you will and to take the kind of risks that might have not been available in decades past.
Zeeshan?
I'm not sure if I had much to add on top of, on the sharp things that Jonah was saying. I would say certainly that I agree with the principle that the freedom to speak however you want to shouldn't be conflated with the idea of that being useful or wise or enriching or enlightening for the public, and certainly within the parameters of freedom of speech, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't discourage unintelligent or backwards kinds of speech as well. But again, we have to disentangle these questions of legality and our political culture, and then this sort of weird, strange gray area of major tech platforms that are becoming, in effect synonymous with the public square, but still are permitted to regulate speech in ways that the government isn't.
I also think we have to be very aware of the incentives of the platform. So I'll give an example. So on Twitter, let's say you're a news reporter and you've noticed that when you publish a new piece of news that no one else has, you get more engagement, more retweets, more likes. Well, that's great. And you're still doing your job. You're putting out news. But one of the incentives that might be at play there is suddenly pieces of news that aren't actually news, that are scooplets rather than scoops, or even things that have been previously reported, or things that are slightly out of context, or things that aren't fully confirmed. Those might become more attractive for you to post too. And that's because Twitter gives you positive feedback for essentially doing that. And so that's another thing to just be really, really wary of, and another additional responsibility, I think, just of living life on those platforms as a journalist.
I'm going to make an appointment to have my tantrum about Twitter in about 5 minutes, and we'll come back to you about that. But I want to ask one more question along the same lines here. Very often when a presidential administration will argue that it would be harmful for national security reasons for a publication to publish anything at all about troops, about national security, very often that is rooted in political damage rather than national security damage. When I was a young reporter at the Post, there was an epic confrontation between my newspaper and the Nixon administration over something called the Pentagon Papers, which was an analysis of the American involvement in the war in Vietnam, not flattering to either the current administration or the one before. And the Nixon administration asked that this not be published, demanded that it not be published, by flying the flag of national security when it was obvious at the same moment that there were political considerations. So how in the world are we ever going to sort this out as journalists? I know we have to take it one case at a time, but where do you think the boundaries lie about political issues as opposed to national security issues?
Who's going first?
That's all you, Zeeshan.
That's very generous of you, Jonah. This is, yeah, I mean, the reason I have trouble answering questions like this a little bit is because I always find this to slide into a broader discussion, which I think we may or may not end up delving into in a more sort of straightforward way about the impossibility of neutrality or objectivity. But I think that some of these, there's no like science behind the question of the difference between national security and political interests of an administration. Like these things can blend together. And for me, a lot of it comes down to if you're a journalist of a specific publication, it probably depends on what kind of political commitments your publication has. I think that a publication like the Washington Post has, while they've done tons of great investigative work and stuff, and in a way admire, done things that are embarrassing for governments, I would think it's safe to say, for example, the general posture of The Intercept, which is a left-wing publication, is more adversarial towards the government. And the judgment calls that The Intercept would make when digging up scoops, or say that, you know, this guy Ken Klippenstein at the Nation would make, would probably be different than the judgment calls that would be made at, say, the Washington Post or the Times on some of them. And that is in part a function of their sort of commitment to what they understand as the public interest, and also the sorts of relationships their newsrooms have with the Pentagon, with the State Department, what sort of sources they're willing to burn. And so from a more left-wing perspective, I think there may be more willingness to view saying, doing things that the government might consider jeopardizing national security as in the interest of global peace, right? Saying something about how things aren't going well with the war in Afghanistan, like maybe a reporter at The Intercept would counter being like, yeah, well, if we give these troop movements away, yes, it could potentially endanger the lives of this set of 30 troops, you know, this troop or this, you know, the names are escaping me, but this specific unit. But The counter to that could be, but this war is endangering the lives of millions of Afghanis. And, there's a utilitarian calculus going on here. And if we don't say anything and uncover these truths, then those people's lives will be jeopardized. So a lot of these things are a function of just sort of ideological commitments.
And newspapers, I think it's fair to say that newspapers are devoted to the public good. But what Zeeshan, I think, is saying and what has become, I'm wary of asserting that things are now more complicated than they've ever been, but this is a particular complication of newspapers that are operating as global newspapers. So I know for the New York Times, what is that public? Is it the American public? The New York Times is an American newspaper, or is it a global public? We are expanding all over the world. We have readers all over the world. Who is our responsibility to? And I would say it is kind of the global public, but I do think there are traditions at play. There are different incentives at play, and these are incredibly complicated and interesting, but really, really complicated questions as these news organizations grow so big.
Well said, both of you. I want to move along to the question of reporters and editors' personal politics and how those politics either inform, don't inform, or should not inform what they do. Jonah, I imagine the same thing is true at the Times that was true throughout my time at the Washington Post, where we were stonewashed, we were utterly incapable of having any public political presence whatsoever as a condition of employment. We could not belong to a political party, we could not give money to anybody, we could not sign a petition, we could not demonstrate or walk in a demonstration, even though that right is in the Constitution. Do you think those days are done? Can you still be a fair journalist and still have personal political views?
I think that's a really, really interesting question. I'm gonna quibble with the premise, which I think is very obnoxious. There's two things. One, I think this is very much an active conversation. So I think there are kind of people who would argue on both sides. My argument would be, and I know that Zeeshan agrees with me, so I'm happy because I know he'll back me up here, is that there is no such thing as being apolitical. And someone who believes that they are apolitical is essentially wrong. And so I'll give an example because I was thinking about this. If I had a dreamer in my family, someone who was aided by that legislation, I would have a different relationship to what dreamers are, whether or not that legislation will be repealed, than I would if not. I think what that demonstrates is not only that the person with the dreamer in their family has a politics, but the person who doesn't have a dreamer in their family also has a politics. They are also informed by that life experience. So I think when we pretend that we do not have political worldview, we do a disservice to the fairness we are trying to achieve. What is still true is that the New York Times wants to be fair, wants to be open, and wants to hear out all parties that are acting in good faith. And I think if a journalist tries to ignore their own tendencies, their own preferences, their own instincts, their own background, they are going to do a worse job of writing a fair story, even to people they might disagree with.
Zeeshan, any comments?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with what Jonah is saying. I mean, I just think that a lot of these questions are of the idea of journalists not, voting or signing a petition and things of this nature are ultimately more about optics and about managing face for institutions and a bit of a business play because you sound like an entirely disinterested party. And I don't think that they're necessarily inherently bad to do all these things, but there is a kind of a bit of a sort of pretense going on because journalists, any good journalist, doesn't matter whether you're a columnist or you're a hard news reporter, an investigator, you are making judgment calls. You are, sifting through reality and deciding what's true and what's not, what matters, what doesn't matter, why things are happening the way they are, and what the consequences of these things are. And these are all, this is an intellectual exercise that requires judgment calls about the world. It would seem absurd that those same powers of analysis wouldn't bear upon questions of, whether or not the journalist thinks that a certain, candidate would be better for political office. So to make mention another Bob from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward, famously sort of doesn't say that he, says he doesn't vote in the presidential elections.
No, that's
And,
not Woodward. That's Len Downey, the former editor.
oh, but I believe Bob Woodward as well. I mean, and according to the sort of Axios article that I read recently, he said that he would decide whether or not to vote in this very election on election day.
Okay.
I trust you know a lot more gossip and all the real stories and all that than I do. I'm the outsider here, but
Guys, yes, I do.
Bob, we're also Bob,
just
we're interested in your view on this question because I think
yeah, and I do. Yes, please do weigh in. But just to finish that point, I wanted to point out the incoherence. I think of Bob Woodward's point. He wrote an entire book about Trump, and then he in this book explicitly says that Trump is not fit to be president, that he's the wrong man for the job. I can't remember the exact sentence, but it's one of those. But simultaneously is saying that he's not sure if it's appropriate to vote. And I think it's bizarre because he's using his power as a public intellectual to tell millions of people that this person's not fit to be president, and simultaneously saying, I don't feel comfortable weighing in. But you've already weighed in. So it's this sort of, I think it's incoherence. And I think it should be okay.
Exactly right. That last sentence in Woodward's book has attracted an awful lot of attention, almost all of it negative. But I really appreciate the point you just made. This issue of personal political views among journalists teeters on the question of what is fair is what seems to be fair. And all those rules that I mentioned at the Washington Post a couple of minutes ago were designed so that we could deny to anybody who asked or suspected that we were biased, even if somehow in our heart of hearts we had a preference or we had a view. A much tougher situation came up long before most of the people in this discussion tonight were born. In 1972, when George McGovern ran against Richard Nixon for president, the union that represented the entire newsroom at the Washington Post, an international union that had chapters in 5 countries, endorsed George McGovern for president. And all of us at the Post who were covering that campaign screamed bloody murder and said, how in the world can we go out there tomorrow and cover George McGovern without him painting a smug smile on his face? Or how could we go and cover Richard Nixon without him saying, how can you guys possibly be fair? Personal politics is one thing, and group and establishment and interest group politics are another. How do you feel about labor unions representing news people doing endorsements like the one that split the membership in 1972?
That's a great question.
Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah. I don't have a considered opinion on this. That is a great example that I'm not, I haven't really thought through. I mean, I can understand why that will sort of undermine the ability of the newsroom to sort of do its business from an optics perspective.
Right.
And I do think that it makes sense for certain kinds of publications to engage in, some degree of management of public expression of political opinions, and it just specifically the idea of a union kind of it's an endorsement, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and an endorsement seems different than, say, an individual reporter at the Post writing one critical point about one candidate versus another. But the idea of a newsroom-wide endorsement seems to be a sort of a categorically different leap from the perspective of saying, how does, it suggests some sort of consensus ideologically in the newsroom, which probably didn't even exist. So I can understand the idea of wanting to refrain from that thing. I think an endorsement from across a newsroom puts a lot of reporters in a bind. But I think being able to let individual reporters, do what they want in terms of voting, for example, or being critical in a fair way and I think a good reporter criticizes everybody on an individual level is a different thing, and something I would instinctively defend more easily.
Jonah, any comment?
Yeah, I was just thinking it through because I do think it's a complicated question. Going back to the endorsement that I'm more familiar with, which is the editorial board endorsement.
Mm-hmm.
The editorial board at the New York Times fulfills a complementary but different function from the newsroom. So they have different missions. And I think the Guild is again, it is a third party. It represents another mission and another set of values. And so I don't begrudge the union its right to endorse a candidate, I don't think. But I do completely concede that that makes life harder for journalists.
Oh, yeah.
But I think a labor union is not necessarily in and of itself a journalistic endeavor. Journalists may belong to a labor union, but the labor union is not, even though it's representing journalists, is not acting journalistically, it's acting politically.
It's amazing that you say that. You weren't alive in 1972, and that was exactly what the argument was from the point of view of the International Union. We represent you as employees and not as journalists. 48 years later, there's still a lot of disagreement about this. Anyway, let's move on to Twitter if we can. And before we do, I want to tell the folks listening tonight that in about 5, 7, 8 minutes or so, we're going to go to your questions. And we'd be happy to answer them. Please put them in the chat function. You can get there on the bottom of your screen. Jonah and Zeeshan, Twitter does not seem to me to be an active way for journalism to operate. Did I say that carefully enough? I just don't understand how all of us who spend our lives trying to do our very, very best work, careful, thorough, fair, can suddenly blurt something in 280 characters. I used to say 140. Wow, Twitter really, you did us proud, right? By going all the way out to 280 characters. But the question I have for you is about reporters and editors using Twitter to blurt their personal opinions about things. There was recently a celebrated incident at the Washington Post where a political reporter blurted a tweet and was threatened with being fired and was almost fired because that tweet violated internal rules. Should there be internal rules, gentlemen? And if so, how do you sort out a tweeter's right to take a personal stand on something as against that tweeter's role as an employee of a big news organization?
Well, I think there's two questions at play. I think a newspaper or whatever other journalistic institution is well within its rights to regulate how its journalists act on public platforms, including Twitter. Is this the Felicia Sumnes tweet we're talking about?
Right.
So I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that this was Kobe Bryant had just died. There was an enormous outpouring of upset, and Felicia tweeted an article, if I recall correctly, it was from the Daily Beast about the allegations, sexual assault allegations against Kobe Bryant.
Exactly.
And right. So it was a link. But it was a link that seemed to say anyway, I think is fair to say, hey, remember this. Mm-hmm. I know that was against the Washington Post standards, and I certainly would not be commenting on a New York Times journalist. To me, tweeting a relevant piece of news about someone who had just died, who was a public figure, who was being roundly celebrated, I can't draw up kind of my full list of standards right now, but I will say that did not violate my personal standards, and I understood why putting that news out there at that moment made sense. And this is coming, by the way, from a big Lakers fan and someone who was very upset when Kobe died. But I thought that was not beyond the pale, and it made complete sense to me. And I was sad to see that she was disciplined for it.
Zeeshan, do you think that a reporter is a reporter 24 hours a day and can never have a personal self on Twitter?
Sorry, there's a siren. I apologize for the background noise if you can hear it. I'm going to just sort of start by kind of piggybacking off what Jonah said and say that, I agree that companies are within their rights to do so. The sort of vexing reality is that the way they enforce these things is uneven, arbitrary, and sort of incoherent a lot of times. And actually, I maybe will regret saying this, but I'm pretty sure actually that the Felicia Sumnes article that the article she tweeted out, I'm not familiar with how it would violate the Post standards, because what she did was, my understanding is she just tweeted out an article like without really much or any commentary.
Yeah, I believe it was without comment entirely.
Yeah, without comment.
It's also not clear that the standards would have applied to that article, because really the standards were don't do anything to embarrass the bosses. Or,
Right, yeah, exactly. That's the unspoken rule.
yeah,
And,
it wasn't
so
down.
I think it was,
That was the difference.
yeah, so I mean, the article itself, she presented it without comment. The article was a fair, you know, as far as I can tell, from a respectable publication, in reporting on sexual assault allegations against someone who was in the news. I'm not familiar with any normal sort of code of conduct in newsroom that says you can't tweet out an article by a credible news outlet. What seems to have happened, as sort of Bob is alluding to, is that she was saying something that seemed to be on the wrong side of public sentiment at that point, which was that there should be a general sort of consensus that we should be sympathizing, and then this is at odds with the way we should be expressing sympathy, and people felt angered by it, and she was suspended for a long period of time. I don't know what her current status is.
She's back at work.
She's back in writing. Yeah.
Okay, she's back in writing. Yeah. So I mean, that stuff is a good example of how these things are just not enforced in ways that really make sense. And I think the suspension was done to just sort of quell the sort of uprising of people who were furious, and the fear that there would be reprisal through days of coverage of the Washington Post doing something that was crass, or potentially maybe just harassment of the reporter or the editors, and just trying to sort of preempt that. But the problem is that that is not what any newspaper, any respectable publication should be in the business of. They're in the business of, conveying truth, and that sometimes can be popular and sometimes that's unpopular. But if you're dealing with things that are accurate and empirically defensible, there's a whole spectrum of debate to be had about any given issue. And what you're signaling to people in your newsroom when you're doing that is that, you should be saying things that are in vogue. Well, that's literally the opposite of what attracts me to being a journalist personally.
Right, but
I revel in any opportunity to be able to say, not revel, because sometimes it is painful to deal with the pushback, but I view it as my responsibility to say, if something seems widely overlooked or is being crowded out by people who are influential, it is incumbent upon the journalist or the public intellectual to sort of say, well, this is a true thing, consider this as well. And I don't have any opinion on that specific debate of Kobe Bryant and how you should, express sympathy. But yeah.
the issue there, as you both have said, it was thou shalt not embarrass your employer.
Right.
And at the same time, thou shalt not speak ill of the dead, particularly if the dead died in a spectacular helicopter crash. And that doesn't sound to me like a policy, and it doesn't sound to me like anything that is really clearly connected to the spirit of the First Amendment that we've been talking about here tonight. Any thoughts about that, guys?
Well, what I will say more generally, kind of in defense of these institutions, is that you have these places that, unlike the tech platforms that we were talking about earlier, have a long history of governance and of figuring these things out. And I know at the Times there has been some arbitrariness, et cetera, but there's also a real effort to figure out what Twitter is for, how it can aid our reporting, and make policies that complement that. And I don't think that the Times, and I don't think that the Post, and I don't think that anyone gets it right all the time, but I do see that effort. And so speaking up in defense of my employer, but I do think that the newspapers are still very much trying to figure out what this platform is, how it can be useful to them as a business, but also how it can be useful to us as journalists. And that's very much an ongoing conversation.
Okay, Zeeshan, you get the final word before we go to questions.
I would say that that it's true that these institutions had a long sort of history of trying to figure this out, and I just think that they're very far from figuring it out. It's very obvious if you see this sort of range of commentary from different kinds of reporters at places like the Times and the Post, that some of them feel a lot freer than others, and I've heard from a lot of reporters and editors at both these publications that they feel that these things are not enforced in a uniform or sort of or coherent way. And then to, we've spent a lot of time talking about the Post and the Times, not by design, but I guess it's just gone that way because they're good examples for talking about these issues. But I can say for a lot of the new media outlets that I worked at that are digital native and younger, like Vox, like Vice, et cetera, these policies are also immensely complex and sources of controversy and internal debate as well. Vox is a place that is, I think, very concerned with getting the details right and being rigorous and being empirical, but also the newsroom is openly, has writers write from, a point of view often, and not outright opinion pieces, but expresses sort of where things come from. And there's been all kinds of fights between, this is what are our rules for conveying these things publicly, actually? We didn't decide whether or not this is on the record, off the record, whatever. But the point is, I mean, this is commonly known that there's debates about how, what reporters should be able to say, even at places where it's considered more open and free. Yeah.
Okay, well said, gentlemen. Anna Wyeth, back to you. And Anna is going to be the air traffic controller for the questions.
Well, I have a few that have come in that are pretty topical for what you all were just discussing. One is actually from a current student, which I would love to ask. How has censorship influenced your job as a journalist? And is it hard to ensure that your opinions don't get integrated within your writing?
Well, let me take that first, guys, if I may. I have never been censored, not once. I have self-censored many times, and I have debated the question of censorship both with myself and with my editors many times based on cultural leanings and cultural assumptions more than on some heavy hand coming down on me as a reporter. The issues for reporters are, whom do you interview, at what length do you interview them, and with what kind of an open tablet do you accept information from people? How wide a net do you cast, and who's in that net? And if you only talk to people who look like you, and if you only talk to people who think like you, and you only talk to people who live in your neighborhood, you're not going to be much of a journalist. So I don't know that censorship is really the point here. I think the question is, how wide a capture do you want to get on any one story, and how much time do you have to do that capture?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I would add to that, kind of to address the second part of the question. My job is to talk to people and find out what they think, and then pattern sort. If 3 people tell me something, that's more reliable than 1 person telling me something. If 15 people tell me something, that's more reliable. And so what happens is, my opinion is not what I worry about in influencing my articles. It's actually the way that I sort the patterns of what I've learned and present that information. Now, that's a fraught exercise, and I think it would be silly to pretend that it wasn't. I have a lot of power when I do that kind of thing. But it's not necessarily opinion that I'm worried will bleed in. It's more, am I presenting this information in the most accurate way possible? Did I do the work beforehand to make sure that what I now know is correct enough to go with and to publish?
The issue of time here is something we could talk about for the next hour. I have made a lot of mistakes in my 55 years as a daily journalist, and every single mistake I have ever made is because I was in too big a hurry. I was rushed. I didn't do the extra phone call. I didn't walk all the way around the information that I already had and kick all the tires and make sure that I had the full picture that Jonah just mentioned. So journalists are so often portrayed as great slingers of basic truth, but we are just trying to make deadlines and do the best we can and produce the first rough draft of history. We are not gonna be perfect.
Well, I think that leads really thoughtfully. Sorry, Zeeshan, did you have something to add there?
No, I just wanted to say, because I was going to give examples of what I think are de facto something approaching censorship, but also if we want to move on to the next question, that's fine as well, whatever you want to do. Okay, I'll be quick about it. I won't go into the detailed examples, but I'll just say that we don't have a problem public sector of government censorship in media in a serious way in this country at all. But there are different ways that censorship can take effect through the private sector. One of them was sort of mentioned before, is that increasingly we're realizing that big tech platforms do have the ability to regulate the spread of certain truths, and that increasingly that may infringe upon the transmission of legitimate information, and that effectively algorithms can determine what should be considered popular and what not in a way that has nothing to do with the public interest, but the interest of these private companies. Facebook will say something should be more shareable than something else based on what they think is good for Facebook. The other example, I can't disclose the outlet or the journalist, but I remember hearing about a journalist having trouble publishing something about a sexual assault allegation against a certain political candidate because they were afraid they're going to be sued by certain sort of actors affiliated with a political campaign, and they were in a rush, and they were a small newsroom and didn't have a lot of legal resources, and so they decided that it wasn't worth it because they were really afraid of getting dragged through the mud. Your ability to speak truth can also be a function of how much money you have in a newsroom and to deal with legal repercussions.
That's an excellent point. Anna, what's next?
Thank you, guys. I think we have a couple questions that are similar, so I'm going to try to paraphrase here. But in looking at what complications or concerns do you see when news reporters, like for publications like the Times or the Post, also become pundits on shows that are more opinion-based or in outlets that are more opinion-based? And are there lines that people have to take care not to cross? Do they limit themselves in what they say or how they talk about issues? One or the other.
I love this question.
Yeah.
I think we often draw this distinction between Twitter, for instance, which we think of this incredibly toxic place, and cable news, which too often is kind of dismissed or not thought of as a similar place. And my response to a question like that is broadly similar to my response to Twitter, which is that going on cable news anywhere where, as a journalist, you are allowed to talk freely, including this venue, you have an additional responsibility to talk about what you know, to not talk about what you don't, and to not give in to the incentives of the platform. And so I think the incentives of the cable news shows to be exciting and be fast talking and seem to know more than you do are not dissimilar to some of the incentives on Twitter. And so my response is not that journalists should not go on those shows, but that they should be really cognizant of those incentives, of those dangers, and be as responsible as possible when they do so.
Zeeshan?
I honestly don't think I have anything more to add on that. So, yeah.
Okay, well, let me just pipe in with one thing here. Jonah, when reporters are invited on cable shows, there's the roar of the grease paint in the air. There's a lot of money hanging around. There's a lot of fame hanging around. There's a lot of possibility for book contracts. I agree with you completely that the individual journalist has to be conscious of not going overboard and not talking about what he doesn't know. But when the red light goes on and there you are sitting on the set and it's all pretty dramatic and exciting, it is very, very hard not to cross that line, particularly when you could be feathering your own career nest. And again, we could talk about this for hours, but I like the idea that you see this as a split between purity and impurity. I think there are lots more impurities, and they are these green things with the faces of dead presidents in the middle of them.
Yeah, I think that's true. But there's also, that's the flip side. I mean, anytime you tweet, it's a much less sure thing, but the same kind of temptations are definitely at play. You are still increasing your brand, increasing your public profile. And so I think it's, the comparison makes sense.
Anna?
To Jonah's point a little earlier about sorting through biases, how do you think good journalists compensate for their particular bias, and especially class bias? This is I'm phrasing here from the question, but gone are the days of the gumshoe journalists, that many are well educated or come from upper middle class backgrounds. And so how do you think about compensating for that particular bias as you write?
That's a great.
Go ahead, Zeeshan.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I would just say a lot of it You know, to some extent, one is just acknowledging that it exists, and there are limitations to your ability to transcend that kind of thing, and that at the end of the day, you are sort of your way of thinking probably is indelibly affected on some level through a certain upbringing and certain sort of offerings, based on socioeconomic status, milieu, and so just awareness of it is one major step. Another issue is, the way you choose to immerse yourself in the world, and really through reporting. I think I exist in the world of where I do some reporting, and I also do a lot of analysis and commentary, and I sort of, and some of my reporting, some of my writing is a blend of sort of all three of them. And one thing that I sort of make a great deal of effort to do is that no matter what kind of piece I'm doing, whether it's a highly opinionated piece or something where I'm less voicey, is I try to do as much reporting as humanly possible to the extent that I can on any given piece. And that means like talking to lots of people who, as much as you can, getting on the ground. And if you can't be on the ground, talking to as many people as possible and talking to experts, embedding yourself in it, getting to know, the background of a specific situation can mitigate against a sort of abstract notion you may have about the way the world exists that's based on these sorts of, preconceived notions. I think a good example recently was, I think someone tweeted a photo of one of the people who was trying to kidnap, conspiring to kidnap the governor of Michigan. Jonah, do you know what I'm talking about? So there's this photo, yeah. And he said, like, this is the home of one of the kidnappers. Can we at least admit that poverty is a contributor to this kind of radicalism, presumably kind of, sort of right-wing, white nationalist radicalism? And he's put out this photo of a messy looking yard with a couple of pickup trucks, a house, and a big kind of trash collection unit. And someone quote retweeted who grew up in Appalachia and said, like, this looks like someone who's not poor at all. You just have never left the city. And there's this whole debate going on about like whether or not this yard was like a real emblem of like poverty or not, and like class bias of a lot of people who are caught in these like absurd urban bubbles and don't even know, like, look, and the woman who tweeted it out said, like, there's pickup trucks here. That unit is actually costs a lot of money. That house is not in good shape, but also they probably aren't poor. Like, you need to actually like know what you're doing. And that's to say nothing of the fact that there's lots and lots of social scientific literature suggesting that a lot of radicalization, ideologically speaking, comes from people who are middle class and upper middle class. Famously, a lot of 9/11 affiliated terrorists, for example, come from affluent backgrounds disproportionately. So report before just sort of spouting off based on what you think you know about the world.
But this is also a good moment to kind of pitch people to support local news, because one of the contradictions inherent in what Zeeshan is saying is that the people who have money to send reporters every which way these days are these institutions that more and more employ white collar journalists, right? So the New York Times is sending Ivy League educated, comfortable people all over the country. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but to the questioner's point, and to Zeeshan's point, there is a degree to which you can't do it. So local news is just immensely important. And people who know their community and know these people and can get out and report in the way that Zeeshan's talking about without some of these biases that come from really different class backgrounds, they can just produce a product that is really remarkable and absolutely worth supporting.
One point I'd like to add is there's a slogan in journalism that we exist to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. But I think the best journalism, as you guys have just said, is when we become uncomfortable as reporters ourselves and push ourselves out of our comfort zones. And I'm reminded of, excuse me, a great debate that raged in my newsroom in the 1970s and 80s about who spoke for the Black community in the United States. And the white power structure at the Post had absolutely no honest answer about how to answer that question. So everybody had Jesse Jackson on speed dial. Everybody called him all the time. And of course, the Black community in America then and now is as diverse as every community. It was just not good enough to be a good reporter and only call the easy person. So I think journalism could do much better at that. I think that local level journalism probably has an easier time of it, as Jonah suggested.
And I'd be sorry, just to add on one extra point, I mean, that we're all sort of hinting at, is just that it's very sort of, there's a huge conversation about increasing racial inclusivity, gender identity, and you know, gender-based inclusivity in newsrooms, but there is almost no conversation about doing that along the axis of class. And this is part of just sort of a broader shortcoming in the way that popular liberalism functions today, is that there's an absence of class analysis. And yet, like with the media crisis, the revenue crisis in media today, newsrooms are growing smaller and smaller. It's more and more competitive to get into the sector. And all that only intensifies the bias with which employers take people from elite institutions and elite social scenes and exclude people from, you know, poorer backgrounds who are not going to be coming from elite higher education institutions. The density of people from top 50 universities in national newsrooms is just astonishing. And so even if you make them racially diverse or diverse in terms of gender, without this sort of class diversity, you're absolutely sort of hobbling your own ability to understand the world.
If you guys will permit me, I know we're a few minutes over, but I do have one more. There are a lot of questions that came in. I know we don't have time to get to all of them, but if I can ask one more question, to ask about the role of solutions journalism in a civil society, and why perhaps solutions journalism isn't necessarily gaining as much traction at many outlets. And this is a new term for me, so you can forgive me if I'm not explaining it correctly, but should both the question includes, should both consumers and journalists be working to expand the role of solutions journalism within mainstream media?
Gentlemen, you're up.
Zeeshan, do you know what solutions journalism is?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, sort of. I mean, yeah.
I can share the link that the asker shared for it. So the Solutions Journalism Network, solutionsjournalism.org.
I'm going to take a quick look at this.
Okay. So Jonah will study up while I say something that doesn't make that much sense. But I mean, obviously, I do think that there is an initiative by lots of newsrooms to spotlight examples of things going well, good news, examples of policies that solve seemingly unsolvable or perennial problems. And I think those things are important, and not only for citizen morale, but also because they provide alternatives to popular debates. For example, one of the best examples is the frequency with which today, which didn't happen, before Bernie Sanders, but after the Sanders era, and the sort of increasing salience of social democratic and democratic socialist thinking, is a frequency with which we now talk about Scandinavian political economic models as potential things to emulate in the US. If those things weren't brought up, then a lot of people would just assume that the contours of debate are what Democrats and Republicans talk about, like whether or not, which dystopian hellscape private insurance we should use, when we know that not only in Scandinavia, actually across the affluent world and advanced democracies, that national healthcare, government-backed or government-run healthcare works very well and doesn't lead to authoritarian communism. You wouldn't know that a lot of the public is learning about that through these kind of solutions-oriented journalism. So I think it's a great thing to encourage, and it's a hard balance to strike, but it's important.
Yeah, just looking over the website, I don't feel confident in my ability to kind of summarize what it looks to be. I think it is always interesting when people try to conduct new forms of journalism within new parameters, and they come up with a new kind of structure and rubric for to conduct journalism under. And that to me is encouraging. That being said, along with kind of very traditional journalism, there are obviously pitfalls. And so, having spent 30 seconds, it would worry me that solutions-oriented journalism would start to move the goalpost in terms of how it defines solutions and how it defined problems and whether it became policy advocacy. So, which is not to suggest, by the way, that traditional journalism doesn't have just a laundry list of problems of its own, but only to say that new approaches to journalism however kind of exciting or encouraging that might be, would also come with their own issues to avoid, because it's a very hard thing to do perfectly. In fact, impossible.
Nothing to add here.
Well, thank you guys so very much. I know we had a few more questions and we'll leave them for another time, but I want to say thank you on behalf of all of us for spending some time with us tonight. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us on a Friday evening. We really appreciate your support of events like these, of Sidwell Friends, of these fabulous panelists who shared their time and opinions and thoughts with us. We hope you've enjoyed all of the homecoming festivities that have been going on. There's more tomorrow, and for those who are celebrating a reunion, there's lots more to come. But we just truly appreciate it, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.